Okay, I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's session featuring a partner, Elemental Machines. My name is Kevin Miller with Astrix Technology, and we're pleased to present the following topic to you today: laboratory operations as a strategic driver. You can go next slide, please. So before we get into the session, I want to first take a moment and introduce who Astrix Technology is and why we're presenting this series of presentations. We've been putting on this series now for several months, and it's going to continue to go for several more months, where we're bringing together thought leaders throughout the lab informatics industry. We have a good one today. In terms of who we are relative to this market, we're an informatics professional services and strategic outsourced solutions company who's 100% dedicated to the scientific community. A couple of quick stats about our company. We were established in 1995 and are privately held. We originated in the IT division of a company called APBI, Life Sciences, and we operate from 7 offices in the United States in beautiful Costa Rica with headquarters in Red Bank, New Jersey. We work with Fortune 1000 life science enterprises, chemical, CPG, government, research institutions, and other fast-growing IT, outsourced and compliance needs. Our mission has always been to deliver scalable, sustainable solutions for the scientific community. Next slide, please. In terms of how we fit relative, to these different software vendors that are speaking to you in this series, what Astrix does is we have this entire kind of end-to-end services span the complete life cycle of scientific data systems, and that's everything from doing business process analysis to enterprise architecture design, where we come in and we try to figure out for a particular laboratory or R&D group, what is the technology stack that they need relative to how they work or what products that they're delivering to the market. We then do laboratory technology selection services where applicable, and we can develop and implement those technologies. And then when they're developed and implemented, we can do the computer systems validation, and then at the end of that, we can even provide the necessary management of those systems as an outsourced service. Finally, we can do scientific and even technical staffing, so put people into place to not only manage those systems, but put people into place to help run your lab. At the end of the day, we evaluate, implement, and manage systems to enhance the collection and processing of critical scientific data. So that's a little bit about us. So now we'll turn our focus on our speaker today, so we can go to the next slide. Sridhar is with us. He is the CEO and founder of Elemental Machines, a serial entrepreneur in connected medical devices and wearables. He's focused on strategy and management in Elemental Machines, and previously he was founder and director of Misfit, makers of elegant wearable products, which was acquired by Fossil in 2015. Prior to this, he founded Agamatrix, a blood glucose monitoring company that made the world's first medical device connecting directly to the iPhone. So we're thrilled to have him, and he's going to give a great presentation today. So I won't go through and read every line of his bio. There's some great stuff there, but I would like to bring Sridhar on now and let him continue the introduction and then pick up the presentation.
Wonderful. Kevin, thank you very much for having me, and thanks everyone for tuning in. So as Kevin mentioned, my background has been in wearables and medical devices and manufacturing and all that. But what we're doing in Elemental Machines and my interest in optimizing how science is done really stems from the work I did years ago in my PhD, where I really learned that bringing in some sort of engineering type principles into the scientific domain actually helped me accelerate how I was able to discover new insights in my research. And over the years, we put that into practice in my various startups and various companies I've been involved in. But ultimately, what I want to start with is really talking about how laboratory operations is emerging as a new field, new discipline, and how we can look at it as a strategic driver of growth and of competitive advantage. So one of the things I want to start with is a quote by Thomas Edison, which is, "Genius is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration." And to me, this has always meant that ideas are dime a dozen, but actually putting it into practice is where all the innovation happens. And so when you look at scientific progress, in this case, 99%, you could argue, is due to how do you actually execute and how do you actually operate your scientific process or your organization or business as a whole. And there are some very, very good examples that we can point to in terms of operational excellence, and how excellence in operations is the key barrier and key defense moat to certain companies. So the obvious one is Amazon. If you think about Amazon as an organization, on one hand, you could argue that they provide a commodity service, which is they sell you products that generally they don't make. So they're a distributor. They're a modern day retailer. But why is Amazon virtually impossible for anyone else to catch? It's because of everything they've done behind closed doors, in their warehousing, in their analytics, in their pricing. Everything is optimized for how they run the operational aspects of their business. Never mind that their business is selling other people's products to somebody else. But if you look at what keeps them ahead of the game, it is they have an incredibly complex, incredibly sophisticated operational infrastructure. Now, the other popular company I like to point to is SpaceX. SpaceX, whilst they make rockets, SpaceX's business is a service. They provide a service. They don't sell products. And when you look at what has made SpaceX highly competitive and highly, I'd virtually say impossible to compete with, is they've made some innovations on how they operate their business. They've eliminated a huge source of waste, and that is the rocket itself. So granted, they have a ton of innovation and ingenuity behind the reusable aspect of the rocket, but what makes SpaceX fundamentally, I dare say, uncatchable by anybody else is the way they run their business. Is they found the operational bottleneck, which is a huge financial burden, which is the single-use rocket, and they fixed it. And they've innovated to make sure that the service that they provide is highly operationally optimized. And so whilst these things might seem quite a bit away from what we do in the scientific discipline, there are some very, very good lessons that we can learn from all of this. And when I look at what we need to do in the scientific field, scientific world, quite honestly, we need to connect a bunch of dots between a bunch of different things, instruments, machines, reagents, what protocol you're running, who the users are, what the results are, et cetera, et cetera. If anything, the events of the last 12 months have taught us anything, it is the fact that the biotech, pharma, life sciences industry is under more pressure than ever to invent diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines faster than we've ever had to invent and bring to market before. And that's really speaks more to the operational inefficiencies that we have an opportunity to overcome. So pretty much every big pharma company that I've had the opportunity to speak with, they all have some type of smart lab or lab of the future initiative. But if you look at what today's connected lab looks like, it's kind of not very connected. You have a lot of different stakeholders in it. So things like machines and instruments that generate data, things like tracking what samples were used, what batch, what date, what expiration, when they were ordered, how they were stored. Also, who did the work? Oftentimes, you'll have certain individuals, certain laboratory professionals who are just better experimentally than others. And so knowing who did the work, tracking it to the instruments and the samples and the reagents, very important. But then once you get the data, now you need to share it. You need to analyze it. You need to match it up to make sure the protocols were followed correctly. And ultimately, because of this jumble of mess and I dare say interoperable systems, there's a lot of wasted effort. And if I had to summarize this, I think many of us may have read that Amgen study that about 80% of biomedical research is not reproducible. One could argue the merits of that number, but I don't think anybody would stand up today and say that the bulk of scientific research is reproducible. Another interesting study that was performed is about a third of research data, at least in the academic world, really can't be found after a couple of years. And ultimately, labs techs will spend close to 200 hours every year just on manual data entry and ferrying data between different interoperable systems. And a list like this kind of goes on and on and on. And usually when I when I talk to people, and if I could see everybody, I'm sure there'd be quite a few people shaking their heads, or sorry, nodding their heads right now in agreement, because at least for me, these are the kinds of problems and inefficiencies that I've had to face in the past myself. Now, one of the main shifts that I'm seeing in the industry over the last 10 years is that historically, the way that again in the drug development world, historically, the science and experimentation have been carried out first, and then the data has been analyzed afterwards. But over the last decade or so, we're seeing a shift where just the opposite is happening. You're seeing more molecules and more drugs and more therapeutics being designed on computer, being designed through models, being designed in silico, and certainly being designed with a lot of aid from AI and machine learning techniques, and then going to the lab secondary, so following. So although we've had the same stakeholders, the order in which this is happening is shifting. And I think that's a very important shift to acknowledge, and that's the basis for the presentation today. Is the way that we look at scientific operations has to change, and is changing, because of the way that science itself is changing. So the question, of course, is, well, so what do we do about it? Jason Kelly, who's the CEO of Ginkgo Bioworks here in Boston, said it best. There was an article that appeared a few weeks ago where he said, the laboratory is a factory, and that trend is just starting, and it's going to be driving how the biotech industry does its work and does innovation in the next few decades. And I think that's a very succinct way of capturing it. It's laboratory as factory. And what that means is there's decades of best practices from the manufacturing and factory world, so to speak, that I think we can apply to how science is done, and using the lab as a factory for invention, a factory for discovery. But one of the big bottlenecks in all of this is there's about 300 million scientific instruments that aren't really connected to anything yet. They're not going anywhere. And usually when I mention a number this large, there's a little bit of surprise in people's eyes. But I want to point out one very interesting statistic or fact, is that laboratory equipment has a very, very long use life. If not in the primary markets, certainly in the used and secondary markets. So it's not like a laptop or a phone that gets replaced every 3 to 5 years, but a balance from 15, 20 years ago is still good. An incubator, a refrigerator from 10, 15 years ago is still good. A mass spectrometer, an HPLC, if properly maintained from 10 or 15 or even 20 years ago, is still good and still being used. And instruments that were designed back then weren't designed with cloud connectivity in mind. And instruments that are bought today are going to last for another 20 or 20 plus years. So that's something to be aware of. And how do we adapt when we have to move from this kind of a system to one that is far more connected? Well, the nice thing is that we've seen this kind of transformation in other industries, and specifically we've seen it happen in the IT world. And it's less about the tools and software and all that sort of things, but it's a lot more related to people. And what I mean by that is the following. 10, 15 years ago, you had a job description called the systems administrator, or the sysadmin. And if you were lucky, you saw your sysadmin once a year when something went wrong, and otherwise you never saw him or her. And they were usually dealing with things like networks, appliances, hardware, and maybe setting up your accounts and all that. But today, that sysadmin of last decade is today's DevOps engineer. And DevOps is a very, very hard, because DevOps engineers are very much in demand. And the transition from sysadmin to DevOps really has been catalyzed by the fact that the sysadmins had to learn not just how to deal with hardware and how to set up accounts and do some firewalls. They've had to deal with integration with hundreds, if not thousands, of other services, other SaaS platforms. So the fact that DevOps today is a superset of what sysadmins did, but they're also having to deal with writing Python code, dealing with APIs, integrations, and security, and so on and so forth. So we're seeing a very similar transition occur from what people today would, or maybe last couple of years, would be known as a lab manager, to lab ops, and looking at laboratory management not as a management activity, but an operations activity. And what this means is when you think about the complexity of what laboratory operations involves, it's hardware, it's software, it's cloud, it's reagents, it's consumables, it's maintenance, it's all of these things. And if you put all that together, today's lab ops professional needs to deal with a number of different key stakeholders. And one of the key dimensions out of all this is the fact that the data scientist is now a key stakeholder, which maybe 10, 15 years ago, that wasn't the case. So as I mentioned before, if you look at how science was done, a decade plus ago, the folks who are the founders and who were pretty much in charge were generally scientists, biochemists, and so on and so forth. They were the founders, the CEOs, so on and so forth. And they would then bring on board statisticians and developers to crunch the data. Today, what we're seeing with an AI-driven, AI-first type of approach, especially in the world of synthetic biology, what we're seeing is that the data scientists and the computer scientists are oftentimes the founders and oftentimes the decision makers, who then rely on the biologists and chemists to gather the data. So the same stakeholders, but the mindset is shifted. And so we at Elemental, we have a number of synthetic biology customers, and one of the first things we were asked about is do we have API access? And so we very quickly learned that the data scientists are a key stakeholder that the lab operating professionals need to be servicing, in addition to everything else. So if we go back to the slide I had before about, we have a bunch of different lines going everywhere, data's going, from one side to the other and trying to mesh with everything else. How do we actually take care of all this? And so when we think about fixing this, the main thing to do is to step back and say, well, what are we trying to fix? At one end of the spectrum, it's looking at this and saying, we need a lot less of this happening in the lab and more of this, being able to preemptively estimate usage. And so we can pre-order or preemptively order the reagents so they appear on time. And we're seeing some of this actually happening now in different labs. And along this similar vein, being able to predict maintenance, calibration, and other types of PMs based on things like utilization. And we can do all of this if these machines, instruments are all connected up to a system where these things can be tracked. And again, these are some very simple examples that we can pull straight from the manufacturing world. And so how do we see this in real life? Quite simply, we need to bridge between the physical world and the virtual world. So if there's common standards we can rely on, fantastic, not a big deal. RFID, barcode scanning, and that's happening today as well. But one of the things that we see is lacking is connecting up those 300 million instruments to the cloud. And if they're connected to a PC, fantastic. That's a relatively straightforward process. But if it's not connected to the cloud, it's a lot more difficult. And so one of the things that we've done is built a IoT platform that allows for that on one end. On the other end, once it's in the cloud, it's I won't say it's trivial, but it's certainly a lot more straightforward to interface with the relevant software stakeholders on the right-hand side. So different LIMS, ELNs, or even analytical packages like Splunk, or even just repositories like Dropbox and whatnot. So in practice, what we had envisioned is a world something like this, where everything gets connected to the cloud, and from there, all the relevant stakeholders can pull what they need out of it. And so when we look at lab operations as a strategic driver, one of the main questions or the main points that I like to make is that it's going to be driven by people. It's not going to be driven by technology. But so it starts with looking at the person or the team responsible for managing the lab and realizing that they're more than a lab manager. They also have to be an asset manager, a finance and purchasing manager, to some degree an IT security manager, and also a data science manager, at least in terms of curation and availability of that data. And so by looking at the lab manager as a lab ops engineer, then you have a much better sense of all the different stakeholders. So when you do that, there's basically three main principles that I like to point to for how to use lab operations as a very strategic driver. Is number one, financial metrics. Whether we like it or not, the entire world is going to be driven by ROI and financial outcomes. And one of the main things is making these financial metrics measurable and visible. And generally, when people say TCO, it's total cost of ownership, but in this case, it's the total cost of operation. And what I mean by this is the simple case is asset utilization. So when we're measuring, when we're making purchasing decisions, we need to understand what assets are being used, when, and how much. Are we getting 80 or 90% utilization out of these machines? And if not, why not? And we've seen cases where there's 3 or 4 of the same instrument in a particular room, particular lab, and one of them gets significantly more because of where it's positioned. Usually, it's either one right by the door or the one right by the wall. There's also we've actually seen issues with instruments that were placed in certain locations that were just prone to more error. And one of the classic examples I point to is there was an HPLC machine that was placed right under the HVAC air vent. And so it was deemed to be highly unreliable until they were able to measure the ambient conditions, and then they realized that every time the either heating or AC kicked on, it would fundamentally change the temperature that the HPLC was working in. And so being able to look at asset utilization and the impact of that on results and making that visible will actually empower the lab ops engineer to actually be both responsible and accountable for the decisions and the actions that they're entrusted with. The other big principle is to adopt a data-first approach, and I mentioned this a little bit when I mentioned how a lot of the new companies that are emerging are relying on a data-first approach in terms of AI tools and AI type of approach to therapeutics and drug discovery. So what this means is that the data need to drive the purchasing decisions. There was an article that just appeared today about Moderna and what was one of their secret sauces for how they were able to invent and develop the vaccine so fast. And it's that every purchasing decision they made was driven by, is the data capturable? Is it standardized? And is there interoperability? So I'd say I spent a decade in the healthcare world, and interoperability between medical devices has always been, and I dare say continues to be, an issue. The challenge in the medical device world is that it's much more highly regulated than the scientific community that we operate in. So I would expect that the interoperability issues that we're faced with are going to be easier to overcome because of less oversight and regulation, because we're preclinical for the most part. But adopting a data-first approach means that you have things like automation in mind. You have things like data science in mind when you're making purchasing decisions, and basically saying no to hardware and software vendors that have a closed system or don't allow connectivity and interoperability with their data sets. And ultimately, if you have that mindset, then automation becomes a natural. And what that does is that frees up the human capital to move on to more value-added and intellectual tasks. So what we've seen is with our
Sridhar, we might have lost audio there. If you want to give us a check real quick, I want to see if we can't hear you. We might have lost audio. Okay, it would appear that Sridhar is offline, so we'll give him just a moment, folks, and just take a quick pause here, and we'll get him back on in just a sec. Sridhar, do we have you back? We have your screen, but we don't have your audio. We need to get your audio back on. There we are. We have you.
There we go.
Okay, great.
We good?
Going. Yep, we're good. Keep going.
Okay, sorry about that. Let me put this onto. All right, Kevin, where did my audio cut out?
Just about 30 seconds ago. So you can pick up right where you left off here.
Okay, great. I'll just forgive me if I repeat myself. So when I want to look at the principles of what principles we need to follow for really making laboratory operations a strategic driver, it really comes down to three things: making financial metrics very clear, very measurable, especially when it comes to asset management and asset utilization. And generally, and historically, the acronym TCO has stood for total cost of ownership, but in our case, it's total cost of operation. And so we can achieve this if we take a data-first approach. And for our data-first approach, what I mean is that if you look at how science is being done, it's been being a lot more driven by data scientists and a lot more being driven by AI type of approaches. And to do that, and to support that, all of your purchasing decisions need to be driven by the data needs. Quite simply, can we get data into a standard form, and do XYZ hardware and software vendors support open data sharing and API access and cloud access and et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if my audio cut out or not in time, but there's an article that appeared, I think today or yesterday, about Moderna's secret sauce. And one of their main advantages was that they took a data-first approach. They said, look, our data needs to drove everything. And so if you are looking at building out labs and expanding, look at the data export, import, and interoperability approaches. And ultimately, if you can do that, then automation becomes second nature, and the human capital that is currently doing very manual tasks can be moved upstream or moved higher to more intellectual pursuits and allow computation automation to do the more repetitive tasks in a much more cost-effective manner. So let me just pause right there. So in conclusion, what I wanted to hopefully convey in this is that the landscape is shifting. We're shifting from a experiment then data analysis approach to a data first and experimentation downstream approach generally. And to do that, it opens up the opportunity for folks who are traditionally thought as lab managers to step up into a laboratory operations role, much like what we saw sysadmins turn into Devops engineers. We can see lab managers turn into lab ops engineers. And it's all possible if we have a particular approach that data matters and there's financial metrics tied to everything. And I think that's it for me in terms of presentation. And I think we've got about half an hour for questions.
Yeah, we're good. And Sridhar, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and do a couple things here real quick. I'm going to go ahead and get the recording stopped.